Someone walking on water, someone feeding 5,000 people with a few loaves and fish, someone healing the sick, someone drawing huge crowds to hear them and hang on their every word, someone teaching revolutionary things that would change the world, someone rising from the dead. Those are all events that the four Gospels in the Bible, named after their authors Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, claim took place in human history and happened to Jesus, the founder of Christianity. But can those claims be trusted? Where is the evidence? Surely it's far more likely that this stuff is just made up. Sounds like a bunch of fairy tales that Christians have cooked up to make Jesus seem more impressive. Sounds more like the stuff you watch on Stranger Things or The Witcher or Game of Thrones than it does reality. It's fiction. Surely it's fantasy. Maybe Jesus existed and did some good things, even amazing things. But surely it's the truth that Christians have added bits in along the way so that we can't tell what happened from what's just filler. Maybe it's more like the game you play at a children's party, where a message gets whispered from person to person and gets changed as it's passed along. So it's very different at the end than it was in the beginning. That change might be deliberate or accidental, but either way it happens. Jesus did some stuff, but we can't know what, as it's been changed along the way as these things have been passed down. Well, if that's how we think about the four Gospels in the Bible, then no wonder we don't trust them. If the Gospels are the product of a big party game, then it's right that we dismiss them as unreliable, as fantasy, that we leave them in the fairy tale drawer and get on with the rest of our lives. Well, if that's where you're at today, then it's my hope to persuade you to think again. I want to suggest that we're not, despite our initial suspicions, dealing with fantasy, but with fact. And I want to provide some evidence to help you redefine how you think about Jesus' existence, his life and his death. I want to provide you some reasons why we can trust the gospel eyewitness accounts that we have about him. So can I encourage us? Let's forget the party game picture. Let's instead adopt the rigorous analysis of Sherlock or Luther or CSI instead and see where the evidence leads us, even if that evidence is challenging. Now, that might be hard because the stakes are high here, aren't they? The Gospels make staggering claims about Jesus, that he's God himself come to us, God stepping into our world to reach out to us, God come to satisfy the deepest longings of our hearts. And if the evidence turns out in favor of that being plausible and likely, then we need to change the way we look at Christianity. We might need to redefine how we think about things. So where is the evidence? Well, I'm taking it for granted that there was a man called Jesus who lived in the first century. Even if we're suspicious of Christian sources that tell us that, we have the testimony of non-Christian sources. Sources like Tacitus, writing around AD 115, who records the presence of Christians in Rome in the AD 60s, who were identified as followers of Christ. Someone who lived and was executed sometime in the AD 30s in Judea when Tiberius was emperor and Pontius Pilate was governor. Or sources like Pliny the Younger, writing about AD 110, who encountered Christians who worshipped Christ as a god. Or sources like Josephus, writing in the AD 90s, who's aware of Jesus' human family. Those sources fit well with what we find in the Gospels in the Bible. So let's turn to them directly What evidence is there that we can trust them? Well, I think the first piece of evidence for us today that we can trust the Gospels is evidence that the Gospel accounts are early. Evidence that the Gospel accounts are early and therefore reliable. It's most likely that the four Gospels were written within 30 to 50 years of the events of Jesus' life and death and his return to life that they claim to record reliably. Now, if we accept that basic position, there are two questions we need to ask. Firstly, were the stories about Jesus and the sayings of Jesus accurately transmitted over the period before they were written down? After all, to us, a gap of 30 to 50 years sounds quite large, doesn't it? Surely it would have been possible for mistakes to creep in, for elements to be added, for legendary ideas to crop up. We're back then to playing that children's party game, aren't we? Where things get distorted as they're passed on. But the simple answer is that's a really unlikely scenario. We accept eyewitness testimony from our grandparents or from an older generation about the events of the Second World War, for example. And we treat that testimony as basically pretty generally reliable. We trust that it's recalled accurately, even though it refers to events that happened more than 50 years ago. And in the first century Jewish world, people were great at remembering. They were trained to accurately retain stories that could be passed on faithfully from one generation to another. They were an oral-based, a storytelling culture, which was strong at these kind of things. When we see that and we remember that lots of Jesus' sayings are in an easy to recall poetic form, it's perfectly possible for the stories about Jesus to have been faithfully retained over that 30 to 50 year window before they were written down. The experts suggest that the length of time reckoned to be needed for legendary ideas to creep into stories is basically 2 to 3 full generations. And that's longer than the time gap recorded between the events of Jesus' life and them being written down. But the second question we have to ask about the Gospels and their early reliability is that have those accounts been transmitted over the years in a reliable manner? After all, we don't have the original versions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All we have are copies. So how do we know that the Jesus we're reading about today is the same Jesus as he was then? This is really where the possibility of the Gospels being a big party game raises its head, isn't it? And to help us think about this, we need to do some work in the area of textual criticism. It sounds complex. It's not. Let me try and simplify it. In simple terms, the more copies there are of an ancient document, the better. And the earlier those copies are, the better. So we're looking for early copies and lots of copies. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it, to help us piece together an accurate account. So let's run a test case on an ancient historical document, Caesar's Gallic War, written sometime between 100 and 44 BC. Now, the earliest fragment or copy that we have of that document comes from around about AD 900. So that is a gap of around 1,000 years. And we have 10 surviving manuscripts, either in part or in full. So are there early copies? No. Are there lots of copies? No. And yet it's accepted as a historically accurate document. So how do the Gospels and the entire New Testament fare in comparison? Well, the New Testament was written from about AD 40 to 100. And the earliest fragment or copy we have is from AD 125. That is at most 85 years and at the least 25 years from the original version. And we have 24,000 manuscripts, either in part or in full. So are there early copies? Yes. Are there lots of copies? Yes. And when we compare those early and many copies with the New Testament we can read today, we can see there is an amazing level of agreement between what was written then and what we can read today. We can go back, examine the many part or full manuscripts, and piece together with an astonishing degree of confidence that the original gospel accounts have been transmitted reliably through the years. That is strong evidence that the Gospels can be trusted because they are early accounts. Strong evidence we can trust the Gospels because they are early accounts. The second big piece of evidence for us today that we can trust the Gospels is evidence that the Gospels are not made up. Evidence that the Gospels are not made up. Imagine you were writing your autobiography, the story of your life. What kinds of things would you include? If I was doing it, I'd include some of my successes, like the time I won a dance competition, hard to believe but true, or the day that I graduated from university, or the time I managed to put some shelves up and they didn't actually fall down. After all, if that's how people are going to remember us, we'd want to leave a good impression, wouldn't we? I wouldn't include the time I once reversed into a pillar at great speed in a car park and smashed the lights on the back of my wife's car. So if we want to dismiss the Gospels as full of myths and fairy stories made up by Christians, we need to explain the presence of elements that are awkward or embarrassing. Elements that would actually make the Christian message less acceptable to people in the first century. See, we wouldn't include those things in our life story. So why are they in the Gospels? The only possible reason is that they happened, which helps us trust the reliability of these accounts. So what kind of awkward, embarrassing things are we talking about? Well, firstly, if you were trying to make the Christian faith more acceptable to first century culture, you would not make up the idea of Jesus dying on the cross. For the Jewish culture of the day, if someone was crucified, they were under God's curse. They were a lost cause, someone you could safely ignore. And for the Greek Roman world, crucifixion was the worst form of execution, a degrading experience reserved for the lowest of the low, the scum of society, the dregs of the world. Crucifixion wasn't a topic of conversation you brought up with your friends, a little like how we might avoid talking about death or Brexit or the latest box set so we don't give spoilers away. And yet the Gospels teach undeniably that Jesus let himself be executed on a cross, and that we should today trust this man who was crucified. That's not something you would make up if you were trying to make the Christian faith more acceptable. Secondly, if you were trying to make the Christian faith more acceptable, you wouldn't make up the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. In Jewish thought, everyone being raised from the dead was going to happen at the end of time. There was no expectation that a single isolated individual would be raised from the dead in the middle of history. No one was expecting it. Just like no one seriously expects England ever to win a major football tournament again. Further, in the culture of Jesus' day, the status of women was sadly less than it is today. A woman's testimony wouldn't be considered in a legal case because they were deemed unreliable. And yet the Gospels unambiguously insist that it was some of Jesus' female followers who first saw him alive again after death and were charged to tell the male disciples about him. You would never have made this up if you were trying to make your case more plausible. it would have meant a huge question mark being put next to it right from the beginning. And in Greek-Roman thought, the resurrection was not something that people aspired to. It wasn't a popular idea. The goal in their culture was to escape the body, which was considered a prison. The idea of being raised to new physical life would have been deeply unappealing. You would never have made this idea up in order to make Christianity more attractive. And thirdly, if you were trying to present the leaders of the early church in the best light, you would never include some of the awkward incidents that are in the Gospels. Remember, I wouldn't include my car park incident in my autobiography. Yet Jesus' first followers, the future leaders of the church, are presented repeatedly as petty and jealous and power-grabbing. You would never have made these details up if you were trying to present the leaders of the church in a positive light. See, putting that all together means that this doesn't sound like a conspiracy, does it? Doesn't sound like a stitch-up where Christians control the kind of things that went into the Bible so that only the officially acceptable bits made it in. Far from it. The Gospels have a ring of truth about them, that they can be trusted. They don't read like myth and legend. They read like history and fact. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford English professor and author of the Chronicles of Narnia stories, once said this about the Gospels, and he was an expert in English literature. This is what he said. He said, "I've been reading poems, romances, vision literature, legends, and myths all my life. I know what they're like. I know none of them are like this." He's referring to the Gospels. Of this gospel text, there are only two views. Either this is reportage, things that actually happened, or else some unknown ancient writer, without predecessors or successors, suddenly anticipated the whole technique of modern novelistic, realistic narrative. In other words, C.S. Lewis could tell the difference between myths and history. And for him, the Gospels don't read like myth, but as history, something that actually happened. And that's the claim the Gospels make. They claim to be based on eyewitness testimony of people who walked and talked and ate with Jesus. They're based on the testimony of people who had nothing to gain by making the whole story up. They're full of verifiable, testable, and tested historical and archaeological details. Time and again, the Gospels have proved themselves to be reliable. We can trust the Gospels as reliable. There's strong evidence for us that the Gospels aren't made up. Strong evidence for us that the Gospels aren't made up. So where is the evidence that we can trust the Gospels and what they tell us about Jesus? Well, we've looked at evidence that the gospel accounts are early. We've looked at evidence the gospel accounts aren't made up. And you're people who want to take the gospel accounts seriously. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here today. So can I encourage you that if what we find in the gospels is true and reliable and accurate, then this redefines everything. See, the Gospels demand our attention today. Could it be that God wants to say something to you through the Gospels? And that's why they've been preserved over the years. And the Gospel accounts in the Bible are there. They're waiting for you to pick them up and weigh them with an open mind. Wherever you're at, wherever you've come from, whatever questions you may still have. You can read the Gospels with the same attitude that you'd bring to any other historical document and just see what you make of them. Maybe you want to read one of the Gospels with someone from the Christian Union, maybe with a friend who invited you onto the call today. Or maybe you've got specific questions about the Gospel that you want to ask. Well, that's fine. There'll be a chance to do that in a moment, and I'll do my best to try and answer them. See, the gospel accounts in the Bible are there to be tested, and we are persuaded they stand up to scrutiny, so go for it. And as you do examine the gospel accounts, maybe you'll become convinced, as I am, as all the members of the Christian Union here at Nottingham Trent are, that the Bible isn't full of myths and fairy tales, legends made up by Christians, but contains the true events of Jesus' life, events that make the world of difference to our lives today, events that change everything and redefine everything for those who turn to Jesus and put their lives in his hands. Thank you for your attention today. I'm going to hand over to the Christian Union. They'll tell us what's happening next. Thank you.